The phone call came at 3:47 in the morning, and I didn't answer it. I stared at the screen instead, watching my ex-wife's name pulse with accusation. Margaret. The divorce had been finalized 14 years ago, but her number still sat in my phone like a scar that wouldn't fade. I was 52 years old and lying in darkness, hyper-aware of every ache in my joints, every place on my body where gravity had won. The call went to voicemail. Seconds later, a text appeared. Tom's in trouble. Real trouble. You need to call me back. I set the phone on the nightstand and waited for sleep that wouldn't come. My son was 33 years old. Whatever trouble he'd found, I probably caused it decades earlier through some failure I hadn't even registered at the time. The next morning, I did what I'd learned to do over 52 years. I made coffee and pretended nothing was wrong. The kitchen of my apartment caught the early light, casting everything in shades of gray that matched my mood. I'd moved here 3 years ago after the company restructuring, after the realization that staying in the house Margaret and I bought in 1998 meant staying in a mausoleum of better decisions. The apartment was efficient, austere. One bedroom, no memories, no photographs on the walls. This was the life I'd earned. I was calling Margaret back by 7:15 a.m. Standing at the kitchen counter with the coffee still hot in my hands, my stomach already twisting with what I didn't know yet. "He got someone pregnant," Margaret said without preamble. No greeting, no, "How are you, David?" Just the information delivered like a verdict. Her name is Sarah. She's 24. Tom says he loves her. He wants to marry her. But David, she's Sarah Hendricks. That girl who used to babysit him when he was in middle school. That Sarah. I could picture the woman Margaret meant. I had a flash of someone young and blonde from a neighborhood gathering maybe 15 years ago, though honestly all the details had blurred together by that point. I was 63 when Tom was born now. Wait, that wasn't right. I was 34. 34 years old, newly married to Margaret, terrified and exhilarated by the possibility of fatherhood. The math was right. Tom was 33 now, which meant he'd been 5 or 6 years old when this Sarah was babysitting him. 5 or 6, and now he wanted to marry her. Why would he do that? I heard myself ask, and the answer was immediate and obvious and terrible. He would do it because I'd done it. I'd spent my entire adult life making decisions that seemed logical in the moment, but contained within them the seeds of disaster. I'd married Margaret when I was 31 years old because she was smart and beautiful, and she made me feel alive in a way nothing else did. I'd had a son when that marriage was barely holding its shape. I'd stayed in that marriage for 17 years despite knowing for 15 of them that it was over. I'd looked at the ways Margaret's face would go cold when I came home from work, and I told myself it was temporary, a phase, something that would pass. It hadn't, and somewhere in the wreckage of my failure to fix that relationship, I'd created patterns in my son that were playing out now. In his choice to marry someone who represented a fundamental power imbalance, a woman young enough to be someone he'd had authority over as a child. "I need to talk to him," I said to Margaret. "Yes, you do. David, I've tried. His therapist thinks it might actually be fine, that adult love can develop from those childhood dynamics if everyone's consenting and aware. But I'm his mother. I'm allowed to think it's disgusting even if it's legal." I listened to her say my name, my actual name, not the filtered version of my name that exists only in my own head. When had Margaret started doing that? Using my full name like she was speaking to a stranger? We had been so close once. Not just physically, though there had been plenty of that. There had been the particular closeness of two people who believed they understood each other completely, who had built something together and had convinced themselves it was impenetrable. That Margaret was gone now, replaced by this version who spoke to me as if I were someone she was politely tolerating. I couldn't remember exactly when the transition had happened. Sometime in the 1990s, I thought. Sometime after Tom was born and I'd become more focused on my career at the technology firm where I'd spent my 20s climbing toward a partnership I would never quite achieve. We made arrangements for me to come to the city where they lived, a place I visited maybe twice a year now, usually on holidays, usually because Tom made the effort to include me despite everything. I hung up with Margaret and sat with my coffee until it went cold. The apartment was silent around me. I could hear the neighbor's dog barking distantly, the ambient hum of the building's air conditioning, the sound of my own breathing which seemed louder than it should be. 52 years old and I was still making the same mistakes I'd been making since my 20s. I was still failing to understand things until they were far too late. The drive to the city took 4 hours. I made it in silence, refusing to put on music or podcasts, just my own thoughts which were circular and punishing. I thought about Margaret in 1989, the way she'd laughed at something I said in the coffee shop where we'd met. She was a student finishing her MBA, and I was already 3 years into my career, convinced that I was going somewhere important. I'd been impressed by her ambition, by the way she spoke about the future like it was something she could architect. I'd been 28 years old and felt like I'd been waiting my whole life for someone to believe in me the way Margaret did in those early months. Everything had been so clear then. I would build my career. She would build hers. We would support each other. Everything would align. The fact that people change, that clarity erodes, that what you want at 28 is not what you want at 35 or 40 or 50, none of that had occurred to me. I treated marriage like a business arrangement, certain that if I just performed the right actions and checked the right boxes, everything would continue working the way it had on the first day. Tom was waiting for me at Margaret's house, the house I'd helped them pick when Tom was in college, and Margaret had finally saved enough for the down payment. I hadn't lived here, hadn't been part of its purchase in any official capacity, but I'd always felt like I had some claim to it anyway. The front door opened before I could knock, and my son stood there looking exhausted in a way that cut through all my recriminations. He looked like me, or rather, he looked like me looked at 33 before the weight settled, before my face got the particular heaviness that comes with 5 decades of small failures. "Dad," he said, and pulled me into a hug that felt both genuine and performative. "I'm glad you came." We moved inside where Margaret had prepared coffee and pastries like this was a civilized meeting rather than a family crisis. She was still beautiful, Margaret was. Still had the sharp intelligence in her eyes that had first attracted me. She was also now 61 years old and looking at me with a kind of wary sympathy you'd give to a stranger at a funeral who was trying their best but clearly didn't know what to say. "Sarah's at work today," Tom said, sitting down on the couch like he was bracing himself. "I wanted to talk to you first." "I know what it looks like, Dad. I know how it sounds. How long has this been going on?" I asked, and I heard the judgment in my own voice, the automatic disapproval that felt good in a way that worried me. I wanted to find fault in him because finding fault in him was easier than finding fault in myself, in the patterns I'd taught him through every example of my own choices. 6 months. We ran into each other at a conference. I didn't even recognize her at first. It had been so long since she'd babysat. But we started talking, and David, she's incredibly intelligent. She's getting her PhD in environmental science. We have real conversations. We have things in common. And yes, there's a history, but we're both adults now. Margaret's jaw tightened slightly at that. She was doing what she'd always been good at, sitting with an opinion and not expressing it, storing everything up for later. I wondered if that was something I taught Tom too, this tendency to justify and rationalize rather than simply admit difficulty. "So she's pregnant," I said, not as a question. "We're having a baby, yes. In 7 months. It wasn't planned, but we've decided we want this. We want to get married first. Keep things traditional, I guess." He laughed, a sound that had no humor in it. "Is that ironic? Me keeping things traditional?" He was looking at me, waiting for me to say something, to give him some kind of permission or absolution. But I didn't have anything to give him except my own experience of how disastrous it was to marry the wrong person for the wrong reasons. And he hadn't asked for that. I sipped the coffee Margaret had poured and felt the burn of it all the way down. "I'd like to meet her," I said finally. "I'd like to understand this better. But Tom, I'm going to be honest with you, this concerns me. Not because there's anything inherently wrong with it, but because I recognize the pattern. I know what it looks like when you're trying to build something meaningful with someone who reminds you of a different time. I've spent my whole life doing that, and it hasn't worked out the way I hoped." Tom nodded slowly. "I was wondering when you'd mention yourself. Was that unfair?" I asked, surprised by the directness of his response. "A little. I came to you asking for support, and you made it about your own past. Which, okay, fair, you have experience with this. But also, I'm not you. Sarah's not Mom. This is different." He was right, and I hated that he was right. And I hated more that I could see the way my genes had replicated in him. The stubbornness and the defensive quick thinking, and the conviction that he was an exception to patterns that had destroyed other people's lives. He would learn otherwise eventually. Everyone learns otherwise eventually. But he wouldn't learn it from me. He'd learn it the way I'd learned it, through decades of small disappointments that accumulated into something that looked a lot like regret. We talked for another hour, the three of us, and it became clear very quickly that they'd already decided everything. They were getting married in 3 weeks. The baby would be born 6 weeks after the wedding. They'd already started looking at houses with enough room for a nursery. Sarah had been accepted into a postdoctoral program that would let her work from home part-time. The plan was laid out with the kind of specificity that comes from people who've already fought about it and reached a compromise they can both live with. They weren't asking my permission. They were informing me of the decision, giving me a chance to accept it or be left behind. I drove back to my apartment that evening, and somewhere on the highway between their city and mine, I realized what was really bothering me. It wasn't that Tom was marrying Sarah. It was that he'd figured out in 33 years what I hadn't figured out in 52. He was looking at the consequences of his choices before he made them, trying to be intentional in a way that I'd never managed to be. The only people he might hurt were himself and Sarah, and they'd chosen each other anyway, eyes open. That was actually better than what I'd done. I'd hurt everyone I cared about while convinced that I was still making the right choices, still moving in the right direction. 3 weeks later, I stood in a small courthouse in their city and watched Tom marry Sarah while Margaret sat beside me pretending not to cry. Sarah was luminous in a simple white dress, and Tom looked at her the way I'd once looked at Margaret before everything got complicated. The judge, a woman in her 60s who had the bearing of someone who'd seen all variations of human commitment, spoke about the nature of marriage and the responsibility of binding your life to another person's. She used phrases like intentional commitment and choosing each other every day, and I felt something crack open in my chest that I'd been keeping sealed for a very long time. At the reception, which was held at a restaurant with exposed brick and floor-to-ceiling windows, I found myself standing with a drink in my hand, watching my son dance with his new wife. Sarah's hand was resting on his shoulder, and they moved together like they'd been doing this for years instead of months. Margaret approached me, and we stood together in the particular silence that only divorced people who once loved each other can share. "Do you think they'll make it?" she asked quietly. "I don't know. I think they have a better chance than we did. But that's not saying much." "No," Margaret agreed. "That's not saying much at all. We had been married for 17 years. That's a long time to be with someone and then not be with them anymore. For most of the years since the divorce, I'd organized my life around the idea that it had been a failure, that I'd failed Margaret and failed Tom and failed myself. But standing at Tom's wedding and watching him commit to Sarah with what looked like genuine hope, I understood something I hadn't before. Maybe I hadn't failed. Maybe I'd just been doing the best I could with the tools I had, and those tools had been insufficient. Maybe failure wasn't the right word at all. Maybe it was just life, messy and complicated, and never quite what you planned for. "I think I'm going to travel," I told Margaret suddenly. "After the baby's born, after the initial chaos settles." I think I'm going to take some time to see places I've never seen. I spent 40 years working toward a partnership at a firm that never actually materialized. I'm 52 years old. I don't know how much time I have left. Margaret looked at me with something that might have been respect. Where will you go? I have no idea. Anywhere. Everywhere. Does it matter? Not really, she said. But you should go soon. Time moves faster than you think when you're our age. The next morning, after Tom and Sarah left for their honeymoon and the wedding had been cleaned up and filed away into family mythology, I drove back to my apartment and made a decision. I looked at my calendar. I had 6 weeks of accumulated vacation time that I'd never used. The company I worked for now was a smaller operation than the firm of my 30s, a consulting company where I'd been put in charge of a department after they realized I had 40 years of industry experience. I was competent but replaceable, and everyone knew it. I called my director and told her I needed time off. She agreed, sounding relieved to not have me in the office. I'd been acting strange lately, she said. Maybe a break would help. I bought an airplane ticket to Istanbul for the following Monday. I'd never been there. In fact, I'd spent my entire adult life in exactly the same geographic location, working in the same industry, failing in the same ways. It felt radical, at 52 years old, to be boarding an airplane to somewhere I'd only read about. But as I sat in the plane waiting for takeoff, I understood that I wasn't running away. I was running towards something, some version of myself I might become if I stopped organizing my life around the failures I'd already accumulated. Istanbul was overwhelming. I arrived at 6 a.m., exhausted from the flight, and checked into a small hotel in Sultanahmet that the travel agent had recommended. The room was clean and simple, with a window that looked out onto the Topkapi Palace. I stood at that window for an hour, watching the light change, feeling something that might have been joy or might have been despair. It was hard to tell the difference anymore. I spent my first day just walking, letting the city lead me through its narrow streets and down staircases that seemed to appear at random. I passed through the Grand Bazaar at one point and felt the weight of history pressing down on the building, all the centuries of commerce and negotiation and human connection. I sat for hours in the Blue Mosque, not because I was religious, but because the silence inside it was profound in a way I hadn't experienced before. I watched other tourists move through the space and realized that I didn't feel connected to them. I wasn't traveling with anyone. I wasn't performing my travels for anyone. This was just me and my own time. Finally, after decades of organizing myself around the expectations and needs of other people. That night, I called Tom. It was early morning in his city, and he answered the phone confused and worried. "Dad, is everything okay? Are you sick?" "No," I said. "I'm in Istanbul. I took some time off from work. I just wanted to hear your voice and make sure you were all right." There was a pause while Tom processed this information. "You're in Istanbul without telling anyone?" "I told your mother. And I'm telling you now. I just needed to be somewhere else for a while. To think about things." "What things?" I looked out my hotel window at the palace, golden in the pre-dawn light. Mostly about what it means to be almost 60 years old and realize that I've been making decisions based on fears instead of hopes. And about how you're getting it right, Tom. You're learning from watching me get it wrong, and that makes me very proud. Tom was quiet for a long moment. "Dad, did you have a breakdown?" I laughed, surprising myself. "Maybe. Or maybe I'm finally having a breakthrough. I'm not sure yet. Ask me again in a few months. I spent 6 weeks in Istanbul, and then I spent 2 weeks in Athens, and then I spent a month in Berlin. I traveled alone, staying in small hotels, eating in neighborhood restaurants where no one recognized me as American. I read books I'd always meant to read. I learned basic Turkish and Greek. I thought about my life with the kind of clarity that only comes when you remove yourself completely from the context of your own existence. And slowly, very slowly, something shifted in me. I understood, finally, why Margaret had left. She hadn't left me because I was a bad person. She'd left because I was a man who believed that love meant staying in something uncomfortable rather than trying to create something new. She'd left because, at 45 years old, she realized she still had time to build a different life. And I'd let her leave while holding on to a version of myself that was already obsolete, a version that thought failure was permanent rather than just a place you pass through on your way to becoming someone different. I understood finally what Tom had been trying to tell me about Sarah. He wasn't repeating my patterns. He was breaking them. He was choosing someone intentionally rather than just accepting what he'd been given. He was building something with his eyes open instead of sleepwalking through decades like I had. I understood, finally, that being 52 years old wasn't a sentence. It was an opportunity. I could have 10 good years left. I could have 30. I couldn't know. But knowing that the time was finite made every day suddenly matter in a way it hadn't when I was 30 and convinced I had forever. I came back to my apartment after 6 weeks and found it exactly as I'd left it, sparse, empty, waiting. But it didn't feel like a mausoleum anymore. It felt like a place I was choosing to rest before moving on to the next thing. I called Tom and told him the baby's room should be painted blue. He laughed and said Sarah had already decided on a soft green. I called Margaret and asked her if she'd like to have dinner sometime, just the two of us, not as exes but as former partners who'd shared some life. She said she'd like that. The company I worked for offered me a promotion when I returned more money, more responsibility, more of the things I'd been chasing for 40 years. I turned it down. Instead, I asked if I could transition to part-time consulting. They agreed, though my director seemed baffled by the request. I was finally getting the career advancement I'd always wanted, and I was choosing to step back. She didn't understand that I'd spent decades trying to build something in the wrong place, trying to be someone that I'd never actually wanted to be. Tom's daughter, Elizabeth, was born on a Thursday in March. She was 7 pounds, 3 ounces, and absolutely perfect in the way that newborns are wrinkled and red and completely indifferent to the fact that she'd just become the center of everyone's universe. I flew to the city to be there, and when they placed her in my arms in the hospital room, I understood something about legacy that I'd never grasped before. It wasn't about the career you built or the money you accumulated or the reputation you protected. It was about the patterns you broke and the chances you gave the people who came after you to do better than you did. "What do you think?" Tom asked nervously, watching me hold his daughter. "I think she's going to change everything," I said. "I think she's going to force you to be more intentional than you would have been otherwise. And I think that's exactly what you need." Sarah was sitting in the hospital bed, exhausted and luminous, watching her daughter being held by her father-in-law, a man she barely knew. But she'd smiled at me when I came in, a genuine smile without any edge to it. And I'd understood in that moment that she wasn't a victim of Tom's confusion or a symbol of his unresolved issues. She was a woman who'd loved someone since she was young and had the courage to pursue that love even when it would have been easier to walk away. She was braver than I'd ever been. I became involved in Elizabeth's life in a way I'd never managed to be involved in Tom's. I came to the city once a month for the first year of her life. I helped Tom and Sarah put together furniture and figure out how to be parents. I held Elizabeth while they slept, watched her dream in her bassinet, understood with a clarity that had been missing in my own fatherhood that love meant being present even when you were terrified. 3 years passed. Elizabeth started preschool. Tom got promoted. Sarah's postdoctoral research was published in prestigious journals. The family stabilized into something that looked like actual happiness, messy, complicated, but real. And Margaret, having watched from the sidelines, told me one night over dinner that she was proud of me. Not for the travels or the new career trajectory, but for being the grandfather she hadn't expected me to be. "You're different," she said. And I wasn't sure if she meant different from before or just different in a way that she hadn't predicted. "You seem like you finally stopped fighting something." "I've stopped fighting the idea that I was supposed to be perfect," I said. "I've accepted that I'm just going to be whoever I am at any given moment." Some of those moments will be good, some will be terrible, and I'm going to try to be present for all of them instead of pretending they're not happening. The betrayal, when I finally understood it, came from a very different direction than I'd expected. I was 57 years old, sitting in my office on a Tuesday morning in March when I got a call from Margaret. She was crying, which was something I'd almost never heard her do. She asked me to come to the city immediately. I drove the 4 hours convinced that something terrible had happened to Tom or Sarah or Elizabeth. When I arrived at Margaret's house, I found her sitting in her kitchen with Tom, both of them looking like their world had collapsed. "Sarah's been having an affair," Margaret said without preamble. "Tom found out last week. He's been trying to figure out how to tell you." I looked at Tom, and I could see the familiar shape of betrayal in his face, the shock, the denial, the slow settling into reality. He was looking at me like he expected me to say something wise, like my own failed marriage somehow prepared me for this moment. "How long?" I asked quietly. 6 months. It started with someone at her university, a colleague. He left his wife and moved to take a position at another school, and Sarah says it was just going to end anyway, that it didn't mean anything, that she loves me and Elizabeth and doesn't want to throw everything away. This was the moment where I understood the whole betrayal. Not just the one happening now, but the accumulated betrayals of 5 decades. Not the ones done to me, but the ones I'd done to myself through my failure to be present, through my insistence on building lives around external structures instead of internal truths, through my belief that as long as you didn't explicitly acknowledge a problem, maybe it would go away. "Tom," I said, sitting down at Margaret's kitchen table, "I need to tell you something that I should have told you years ago. You were right when you were young. I did turn you into a reason to stay in a marriage that should have ended. I taught you that commitment meant suffering through things that were fundamentally wrong. And now you're living that. Sarah is living that. Elizabeth is living that. What are you saying?" Tom asked, and his voice was breaking. "Are you saying I should divorce her?" "I'm saying that you need to figure out if what you have with Sarah is something you want to keep because you want it, or something you're keeping because you think you have to. I spent 17 years in a marriage that was over after year 3. I stayed because I thought that's what you did. You committed to something and then you accepted it, even if it was making everyone miserable. Your mother left to save herself. I'm asking you, do you know what you're leaving if you leave Sarah?" Tom was quiet for a long time. Margaret was watching me, and I could see that she understood what I was doing. I was finally, after 57 years, teaching my son the one thing I'd learned through living it, the difference between courage and cowardice, between staying because something is good and staying because you're afraid. "I don't know," Tom said finally. "I love her, but I also feel like I've been betrayed, and I'm angry, and I don't know if that's something we can come back from." "That's actually a very honest answer," I said. "I would sit with that anger for a while. I would let yourself feel it completely before you make any decisions. And I would strongly suggest that you find a good couples therapist who can help you both figure out what you actually want, not what you think you're supposed to want." Over the next 6 months, Tom and Sarah did exactly that. They went to therapy together and separately. They had hard conversations about what had led Sarah to the affair, her feeling like she wasn't being heard, her sense that she'd sacrificed her own identity to be a wife and mother, her realization that she'd built a life that looked good on the outside but felt empty on the inside. Tom heard these things and recognized them as familiar, recognized them as the patterns that had existed in his own parents' marriage. They didn't immediately reconcile. In fact, they spent 3 months living separately while they figured things out. But eventually, slowly, they began to rebuild something. Not the same thing they'd had before, that was gone, but something new, built on honesty rather than expectation. I was sitting with Elizabeth, who was now 4 years old, showing her how to paint at my apartment, when Tom called and told me that Sarah was moving back home. They were going to try again, but differently. Sarah was going back to school to complete her PhD, and Tom was taking a step back from his career to do more parenting and part-time work. They were building something intentional instead of something accidental. "I learned from your mistakes," Tom said, "and I understood that he meant it not as an accusation but as a gift. And I'm trying not to make the same ones." "It's harder than it sounds. It's much harder," I agreed. "But you're doing better than I did. You're actually looking at the patterns instead of just sleepwalking through them." "Why do you think that is?" Tom asked. "Why are you suddenly so wise about this stuff?" "I'm not wise," I said. "I'm just old enough now to see the long consequences of my choices. And I regret enough things that I'm actually trying to learn from them instead of just accepting them as inevitable." The years kept moving forward the way they do, and I kept showing up for my family in ways I'd never managed before. I watched Elizabeth grow from a baby to a child with opinions and preferences. I watched Tom and Sarah rebuild their marriage into something that looked like actual partnership. I watched Margaret age and become softer and more forgiving of all the ways I'd failed her. I watched myself age and accept that the things I'd spent the first half of my life chasing were never going to fulfill me the way I'd hoped they would. When Elizabeth turned 8 years old, I asked her what she wanted for her birthday. She said she wanted to go to Paris with me and her dad and mom. So we went, the 5 of us, and I watched my son navigate the city with the kind of joy and presence that I'd never managed to cultivate in my own travels. He wasn't running away from anything. He was genuinely there, genuinely present with the people he loved. I was 62 years old when I finally understood the whole betrayal. It wasn't Sarah's affair or Tom's disappointment or Margaret's eventual departure. The betrayal had been mine, done to myself, done to everyone around me, through decades of choosing fear over honesty, convention over authenticity, external structures over internal truth. I had betrayed myself by not becoming who I could have been. I had betrayed Margaret by asking her to spend her life with someone who wasn't fully present. I had betrayed Tom by teaching him that love meant accepting mediocrity, that commitment meant suffering through things that were fundamentally wrong. But understanding the betrayal was only the first part of forgiveness. The second part was accepting that I couldn't undo it. The years were gone. The choices were made. The consequences were written into the lives of the people I cared about most. All I could do was stop betraying myself right now, in this moment, by being present and honest and willing to change the patterns I'd spent 50 years reinforcing. I retired from my consulting job when I was 65 years old. I had enough saved, enough pension from my early years at the firm to sustain me if I was careful. I volunteered as a mentor for young professionals, teaching them what I'd learned through failure. I traveled more, but with intention now, visiting places I wanted to understand rather than places I thought I should visit. I spent time with Elizabeth, who was growing into a complex and intelligent human being. I maintained a friendship with Margaret, one that finally felt honest and uncomplicated. I became genuinely close with Sarah, understanding eventually that she'd broken her marriage in order to save her life, and that was a more honest choice than I'd ever managed to make. Tom came to my apartment when he was 40 years old and told me that his marriage to Sarah was the best decision he'd ever made. But the decision to work through the betrayal was what made it real. He told me that he'd forgiven himself for almost making the same mistakes I did, and that he hoped I'd forgiven myself too. I told him that forgiveness was still a work in progress, that I was probably going to spend the rest of my life coming to terms with time I'd wasted, but that I was grateful for the chance to see where my patterns led and to change them before they destroyed everything. "Do you think you would have changed if you hadn't traveled?" Tom asked. "If you hadn't stepped out of your life?" "I don't know," I said. "I'd like to think I would have eventually, but probably not. Probably I would have just kept doing exactly what I was doing, keep trying to make a life that never fit me properly, keep disappointing everyone around me while convincing myself I was just doing the best I could." Tom smiled, sad and knowing. "That's very honest. Honesty is all I have left at this point," I said. "I'm 68 years old. I've spent most of my life being something other than myself. I'm spending whatever time is left being actual. Elizabeth was 16 when I turned 70. She was tall and intelligent and had her mother's scientific mind and her father's ability to be present with people. She came to my birthday dinner and gave me a book about the history of Istanbul, remembering that I'd traveled there when I was 52. I looked at this young woman who was going to inherit the world I'd shaped, and I thought about all the patterns I'd broken and all the patterns I'd perpetuated. I thought about the decades that had passed before I finally understood the whole betrayal. And I understood that understanding was its own kind of redemption, not because it fixed anything, but because it meant I could stop doing it to everyone who came after me. I'm going to be a professor, Elizabeth told me that night. Like Mom, I'm going to study environmental policy. I want to help figure out how we can actually change systemic problems instead of just accepting them as inevitable. I saw myself in her determination, but I also saw that she was doing something I'd never managed. She was building something external that aligned with something internal. She wasn't studying environmental policy because it looked good on her resume or because she thought it was what she was supposed to do. She was studying it because she believed in it. And that belief came from a lifetime of watching adults who were honest about what they wanted and what they didn't. I'm proud of you, I told her, and meant it in a way that went far deeper than pride. I meant it as acknowledgement that she'd inherited my genes but not my patterns, that she'd somehow managed to become the best version of what I could have been. Margaret called me on my 71st birthday to tell me that she'd met someone, a man named Charles, a retired engineer who she'd connected with at a bookstore. She sounded happy, genuinely happy, in a way I hadn't heard her sound since we were first married. I congratulated her and meant it, and I realized in that moment that she'd finally released me from the responsibility of regretting what we'd done together. She'd moved on to building something new, and by doing that, she'd given me permission to stop seeing our marriage as a failure and start seeing it as a chapter painful, complicated, but real. I hope you'll come to my wedding, Margaret said, and I heard the hesitation in her voice, the uncertainty about whether it was appropriate for me to be there. I wouldn't miss it, I said. And Margaret, I'm glad you found someone. I'm glad you didn't stay with me trying to make something work that couldn't be fixed. We were young, she said. We did the best we could with what we knew. I hope you finally stopped punishing yourself for that. I wasn't sure I'd stopped, but I was trying. That was the most honest thing I could say, the most honest thing I'd ever said to Margaret, that decades after the betrayal, decades after the divorce, decades after the failure, I was finally, slowly, learning to forgive myself for being human and imperfect and deeply flawed. I was learning to understand that the years I'd wasted weren't wasted if I used them to become someone who could be present for the people who came after me. Tom got the phone call at 3 in the morning when I was 73 years old. I'd had a stroke, a small one, caught early by the fact that my neighbor had heard me calling for help. By the time Tom made it to the hospital, I was already in recovery, and the doctor said I'd make a full or nearly full recovery if I was aggressive about physical therapy. I spent 2 weeks in the hospital and 2 months in rehabilitation, and it gave me a lot of time to think about mortality in a way I'd been able to avoid for most of my life. I understood, lying in that hospital bed, that I was running out of time in a very literal sense now. The decades had passed. The years had accumulated. I'd spent most of my life and recovered a portion of it in my 60s, but even that recovery was limited by simple biology. I would have maybe 10, maybe 15 good years left if I was lucky, maybe 5 if I wasn't, and what I wanted to do with those years was be present, be honest, and help the people around me understand that the patterns we inherit don't have to define us if we're brave enough to look at them and choose something different. Elizabeth came to see me every day during my recovery. She was 17 now and dealing with the realization that her grandfather was mortal, that the stories he'd been telling her about learning and changing and growing were time-limited, that she needed to pay attention now because there wouldn't be infinite tomorrows. I told her about Istanbul and about the years I'd wasted and about the moment when I realized that being 52 years old was a second chance that most people didn't get because they didn't have the courage to take it. "I'm scared," she said one afternoon, sitting in the uncomfortable chair beside my hospital bed. "I'm scared of making the same mistakes you did, of building a life that looks good but doesn't feel good, of wasting time on things that don't matter. The fact that you're scared means you probably won't," I said. "Your grandfather spent most of his life not scared enough. I thought everything I was doing was right because I kept doing it. You're smarter than that. You're going to make mistakes, but they'll be different mistakes. And that matters." When I was finally released from the hospital, Tom insisted that I move in with him and Sarah and Elizabeth. I was going to fight it. I still had my apartment, still thought of myself as independent, but I was too tired to fight and too aware of time's scarcity to waste energy on pride. I moved into their guest room, which Elizabeth had decorated with images from Istanbul and Athens and Paris, as if she was building a museum of my mistakes and my eventual redemptions. The last 3 years of my life were the best ones I'd lived, which was a strange thing to realize at 73, 74, 75 years old. I wasn't doing anything more important than I'd done before. I was just being present. I was there when Elizabeth graduated high school. I was there when she got accepted to universities across the country and had to choose which one to attend. I was there in the everyday moments, breakfast, dinner, conversations about nothing that suddenly became conversations about everything. Tom and I talked about his childhood, and he told me things I'd never known, ways I'd hurt him through my absence, ways my obsession with my career had made him feel like an obligation rather than a joy. But he also told me that watching me change in my later years had taught him more about growing up than anything else could have. He told me that seeing me travel and come back changed had given him permission to try to become someone different than the person he'd been raised to be. "You gave me something," Tom said one evening when we were sitting on the porch together. "You gave me the example of what happens when you don't learn your lessons. And then you gave me the example of what happens when you do. That's actually been pretty valuable. I died in my sleep when I was 76 years old. It wasn't dramatic or painful or anything other than what it was, the end of a life that had been long and complicated and filled with both profound failures and eventual redemptions." At my funeral, Tom gave a eulogy where he talked about his father as a man who'd spent most of his life making mistakes and the last portion of his life learning from them. Elizabeth read a poem she'd written about visiting Istanbul and understanding what it meant to finally choose yourself. Margaret came, bringing Charles, and she stood at the back of the room with tears on her face. Not for me, but for the time we'd lost and the fact that we'd finally, near the end, found a way to be kind to each other. The betrayal, decades later, turned out not to be a betrayal at all. It was just life, the complicated, messy, impossible business of trying to be human and sometimes failing at it spectacularly. It was the years I wasted and the chances I didn't take and the person I didn't become until I was nearly old enough to die. It was the knowledge, finally earned through living, that the worst betrayal you can do is to yourself, through your refusal to see what's right in front of you, through your willingness to accept a life that doesn't fit just because fitting it seemed easier than changing it. But it was also, in the end, a kind of grace, because I had gotten to change. I had gotten to travel and experience and become something different. I had gotten to watch my son and granddaughter inherit my genes but not my patterns. I had gotten to spend my final years being present for the people I loved most. I had gotten somehow to be forgiven by everyone except myself, and to spend decades learning to forgive myself, which turned out to be the most important work of all. Decades passed before I finally understood the whole betrayal. But understanding it meant I could stop doing it, stop betraying myself and everyone around me, stop accepting a life that wasn't aligned with who I actually was. And in that understanding, late as it came, I found something that looked a lot like redemption, not because I fixed anything, but because I finally stopped breaking it.